This is the Odyssey 2, ZIIGAAT's new collab with Hangout Audio, and today we're going to find out if this can live up to the hype of the originals. Starting with the overall sound, the Odyssey 2 has a full, balanced, and natural kind of all-rounded presentation with a slight sub-bass boost. Versus the OGs, the Odyssey 2 now has a slightly more mid-range focus, more vocal approach, less warm, slightly more sub-bass focused, and basically it's not going to be as dynamic and engaging as the OGs. The treble is also smoother and a less colored version of the originals. Mainly the treble on the 2 is now slightly tamer than the OGs. They removed some of the bite from the originals, and talking to Crin, this decision was mainly made because some people found the treble a bit like, I guess, energetic on the OGs, so they tamed it and they made it smoother, which is what the 2s are. Another main change is in the low end, where the 2s are now less impactful. It slams, less heavy. The no way overall is going to be a little bit, cleaner overall. It's less prominent in the bass, but this change also makes the low end better separated. It's quicker now, it's tighter, and it's snappier overall. It just feels cleaner than the OGs. But the good thing is the DD they're using is still pretty good, so the overall bass texture is still top tier for its price, and for most people I think it's going to be more than enough. It's not going to be like, a bassy or like a bass head kind of set. If you want a bassy all-rounder, look for the OG Odysseys or the High 4s and stuff like that. Now the main focus of the 2s and the main differentiator from the OGs is that it's just now more mid-centric. The vocals pop out more, they're just more forward, the clarity is better, there's less treble, there's gonna be less bass, and the vocals, the 2 to 3K region also is boosted a little bit more. So overall, because of all those combined, the vocals are just gonna be clear, you hear them better, the details are slightly just like revealed better than the OGs, and overall if you like vocals, these are gonna be better than the OGs. They are still a higher volume set like the OGs, so I don't really recommend them at like lower volume, because I do think you need more power to kind of like really make these like be at the full potential. And when you do get more volume or power onto these, the vocals are very natural, they're very clean, they're well extended, it's got the power. And basically this reminds me of like the DAYBREAKs and the P50s, but even more like vocal centric with better bass texture and a little bit more resolving overall. Now speaking of the treble, the 2s are now smoother, they're tamer than the OGs. They do sound less in terms of the energy overall. The extension is still enough. I would say it's not going to be like airy or sparkly or like super micro detailed when it comes to the treble, but overall it's natural. You're not going to find it to be like super jarring, peaky. It's not going to go up and down. Overall, it has enough treble presentation, enough treble extension for what it's going for. It's trying to be a mid-range vocal kind of set, and overall it's still decent, but again, I wouldn't say this is like top tier treble. As for the technical performance, the Odyssey 2 sits around the same as the OG Odysseys. Main difference is that the 2s are better in the separation, the mid-range clarity is better, the vocals are better, whereas the OGs have a little bit better like bass texture and treble texture in general. But I would say they're around the same level, maybe like a cleaner kind of sound to the Odyssey 2s. In terms of just like value, I would say they are still decent, but obviously it's not gonna be like super mix 4 kind of level. It's good enough because in terms of accessories, you do get a better case now, you get a actual interchangeable connectors, so this is still pretty competitive in my opinion. Like the overall package is solid, but just not as quote-unquote saucy as the original Odysseys, although objectively the 2s are at least as good or slightly better than the OGs because it's got better accessories now, it's got slightly better separation overall. So basically the 2s are for those who found the OGs to be a bit too bassy or the bite to be too much when it comes to the treble. If you want like a more balanced all-rounded sound, but that's just slightly bassy but also pretty clean at the same time, then the 2s would be quote-unquote an upgrade in that sense. However, if you are an OG Odyssey lover like myself and you're looking for a more quote-unquote direct upgrade to the OGs, then the Odyssey 2s are not that. This is more of a side grade. It doesn't have the same dynamic and the contrast or just the engagement as the OGs. Again, this is a lot, I guess, like mid-range focus and cleaner overall. So on one hand, with this new tuning, a lot more people will be able to enjoy this because this is just the safer pick overall. It's smoother, it's better, all rounded, it's still pretty balanced, the sub bass texture is still pretty good. But the downside is that OG Odyssey lovers are not gonna vibe with the Odyssey 2s as much as they expected it because the sound is, different enough. It doesn't have that same characteristic as the OGs. It's kind of like what they did with the original T's and the T-Pros. Basically, the OGTs had the special sauce in the vocals, but with the T-Pros, they made it just more mainstream and more palatable to most people. Now, genre-wise, since the Odyssey 2s are more mid-range and vocal focused, I would recommend these with like ballads, singer-songwriters, acoustic, indies, or even some pop songs, but mainly at a higher listening volume, because I do think, again, you need some volume to make these kind of open up. However, the genres that don't fit as well on these would be like hip-hop, rap, R&B, jazz, just like genres that needs more like oomph, you know, bassiness, more like body and thickness to the sound. The Odyssey 2s are just not as thick as you would like on those genres, and it doesn't have the same engagement to the, you know, rhythmic section versus something like the OG Odysseys. So for those, I would probably, you know, I wouldn't say I would avoid them, but they wouldn't be my first pick when it comes to like the genre that I would recommend. And scaling wise, again, these are a high volume set, so they do scale pretty well because of the tamer upper mids now versus the OG Odysseys. So we're looking at around 75 to 80 dBs plus depending on the track. But on energetic stuff like K-pop, J-pop, and just like some EDM, I would probably listen to these at around like 65 dBs because the boost in the upper mids does kind of make it a bit shouty on those, you know, more energetic tracks like Miss Green Apple, like Luna, and just not as balanced because, you know, the mid bass is now less, and then overall it just emphasizes the vocals a little bit more. But overall, these sound pretty natural and smooth on most genres. Just don't crank them up too much with K-pop and J-pop. For example, you could probably get these around like 80 dBs or even more on Self-Control by Frank Ocean, which is like a ballad, kind of like slower R&B song. But when it comes to J-pop, this is not gonna get or reach the same volume. Then as for tips, I recommend anything that can just make the sound more dynamic, you know, more bass, more treble, maybe both. For example, I am using the Velvet to Venus, which does boost the low end a bit more, makes it just a bit like more impactful, more to my taste, I guess. But you can also use the ASTRAL Cenas, you can use the Triclearance, you can use the Final Ease. Basically, anything that can make this a little bit more offensive would be nice because this is pretty balanced, pretty smooth, and I do think it could use some, just a little bit more excitement. Now, as for some comparisons versus the DAYBREAK and the P50s, all three of these kind of do the same job in the sense that they follow a, you know, balanced, safe, smooth, not I wouldn't say neutral, but, you know, all-rounded kind of sound. But the main difference is that the Odyssey 2 is going to be a little bit more vocal centric, a little bit more forward in the vocals. Not forward, but the vocals are more emphasized than the other two because it just has less bass and slightly less treble, so it just makes the vocals pop out more. Personally, I would go for the Odyssey 2s because the bass section on these are just like slightly better than the other two. It's basically a P50 but with better scaling and with better bass texture. Because the scaling is louder now, the vocals feel more closer, they feel more intimate, even though at mid volume I would still say the P50s are the most forward and vocal centric out of the bunch. But in terms of like value to performance, the others are $100 cheaper, so if you just want like the best bang for your buck, those do a similar job because sound wise, again, they sound fairly similar in the sound that they're trying to go for, but this is just like a slightly better version of them in my opinion. And then compared to some other all-rounders like the Supermix 4, the Nova, the Chopin, those are also going to be better when it comes to value because they're also like $150, $125 on sale. This is what, $250, maybe $200 on sale, so we're looking at like $50 to $100 more than the others. And detail and technical performance wise, you can make the argument that Supermix 4, Nova, Chopin might be even better than the Odyssey 2s. But if you're looking for just like a better timbre, better tonality, the bass texture is better on the Odyssey 2s. Maybe it's a driver difference, probably, but overall I like the sound on the Odyssey 2s better. It's just less shouty in the upper mids, it's not as thin, and it's fuller and more natural in the overall tonality. In terms of value, I would say, you know, you can't really beat the Supermix 4 Nova or even the Chopin. They're still value monsters for a reason, whereas this is good but not as good when it comes to value. Then versus the Lush, if you're looking for something balanced like the Odyssey 2s but you just want better extended in the treble, a little bit more airy, then that would basically be the Lush. Both scale pretty well, but the Lush overall, you know, has that comfy and, you know, more laid back feeling, whereas the Odyssey 2 is gonna be snappier, punchier, more resolving, better textured when it comes to the low end. Overall, more forward in the vocals and mid-range. Basically, if you want a cleaner mid-range focused sound that scales good, you go for the Odyssey 2s. If you want a balanced, slightly warm and laid back sound, go for the Lush. Both are pretty good scalers and I would say it just comes down to what your preference is. Now, if you can stretch your budget just a little more, I would save up for the ZIIGAAT ARCANIS if you're looking for a vocal-centric set that scales well, because that's basically what the ARCANIS is. It's, in my opinion, the direct upgrade to the Odyssey 2s in terms of vocals, low-end, texture, resolution. You get the special sauce with the vocal and the treble bite, but not overly fatiguing, because even though Odyssey 2's vocals are good, extended, clear, natural, balanced, they just don't have that same quote-unquote ARCANIS magic as the ARCANIS with that, treble goosebump that you get. And overall, for a little more, I would personally go for the ARCANIS. But if you're on a budget, this is still a pretty decent vocal set at its price. Similarly, I would also save up for the Lunas if you have the OG Odysseys and you want that special sauce, but maybe smoother in the treble, a little more airy in the treble, but still have that bassiness and the texture in the low end. That's basically what the Luna is. It's a warm, airy kind of listen. I wouldn't say it's a direct upgrade to the OG Odysseys, but in terms of just tonality, the sound, it is the closest to the OG Odysseys, but just now smoother. But if you don't have the cash, then yeah, get the OG Odysseys if you want something bassier. Then as for a more treble focused playback, you got the KIWIEARS AETHER and the electric CADENZA 4. Both of these are gonna be clean, balanced, but more airy, slightly more bright. Those are gonna feel more detailed when it comes to the treble air, the extension, and just the micro details that you get with those. The No Way is gonna be lighter, I guess more airy on the sweeter sounding on the other two, whereas the Odyssey 2s are gonna feel fuller overall. But if you want something brighter and a little bit more treble leaning, those two are good picks as well. Then lastly, you also got the KIWIEARS ASTRAL and the ZIIGAAT Crescent for something that's more all-rounded, aggressive, more forward in the overall sound. It's gonna be noticeably more prominent when it comes to the bass amount, the impact, and then the treble is also gonna be a little more energetic. Basically, those two are gonna be a V-shaped version of the Odyssey 2 and JM1 kind of sound. So if you haven't tried a V-shaped JM1, then those two would be a good option. But they just don't scale as well as the Odyssey 2s. Not gonna be as smooth and vocal mid-centric. So depending on what you're looking for, if you want dynamics, contrast, if you want something that is just very fun, I guess, to listen to, then those would be, I guess, better for most people. But if you want something that does scale better vocals, better mids, then this is a good pick as well. In conclusion, does the Odyssey 2 live up to the hype of the original Odysseys? I would say kind of. I would still recommend these for an all-rounder, balanced, natural, great sub-bass texture for the price, great vocals for the price. However, it doesn't do anything amazing, but it doesn't do anything wrong. It's not gonna have the same sauce and quote-unquote uniqueness as the OG Odysseys. But for most people, I would say this is the safer pick. And if you just started the hobby, this would probably be the better, all-rounded IEM overall versus the OGs, even though I do prefer the dynamics, engagement, and contrast on the OGs better. It's got that, I guess, special sauce to it in my opinion. But if you just want something that just does everything very well, solid vocals, great bass, you get premium drivers, you got pretty good packaging as well, then yeah, the Odyssey 2s would be a side grade to the OGs, and I do recommend them in that scenario. Anyhow, I hope this review was helpful. Let me know how you guys feel about the new Odyssey 2s, and OG Odyssey lovers, let me know if you're gonna buy these or skip these, because this is slightly different than the OGs, as you can tell in the review. But aside from that, thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see everyone in the next one.
Shout out to Dom Q, Roix Cat, BURAC, Discal Scaldus, Walker Standard, Patrick, User, Contain Quava Juice Gains, Oh Really, Mr. Gorillas, Polly J, Giseng Young, Christopher Jackson, Henry Claudia, Son of a Horse, 777ZK, Wizard, OB, Triple Well Extended, Frickalicious, Ricardo's, Tapis Art, Chuckle Norris 420, Shrimp Back to Lay, FKSRG, Cousin Fat, Julius Phillip, Dad Riddle, Bilha, Armor, Nico, Parham, Nicholas, Addy, Michael, LL here, Andy, Trackstar, Sergip, Torcog, Ryan, Shuri, Raphael, I'm J-Rack, Ori, June, Hakase, LVP Specialist, Emil, Sayaki, Sino Cloud, Sami, Afi Nadim, EGC, Raj, Samantha, Chimika, Nostov, Javier, CB952, Gelblog, AK131, James, Senadan, Brian Carson, and Alejandro. Thank you guys so much for the support.